Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great opportunity and an honor for me to present today the study on corporate anti-corruption compliance drivers, mechanisms, and ideas for change at this 2021 Business Integrity Society Summit, organized by the Global Compact Network of Korea and the Korea Sustainability Investing Forum. I'm sorry that I cannot be present live with you today, and this is notably due to the time difference between Korea and France. In carrying out the study, we wanted to understand why companies adopt anti-corruption compliance systems, how they assess their corruption risks and develop compliance mechanisms, and what are the obstacles they still face. And we wanted to do this with the objective of identifying ways to encourage more companies, including small and medium-sized enterprises, to adopt such measures, and really to inform governments and the policymakers on how to incentivize anti-corruption compliance. The study was developed based on independent research and a survey of 130 companies from nearly 30 countries and interviews with these companies' representatives. The companies represented are largely large multinational corporations, and about 10% of these are state-owned companies. But we also had responses from about 15% of small and medium-sized enterprises. The respondents came from all over the world, and they all conduct business internationally. As you can see from this pie chart, they represent a very broad variety of industries, and often actually more than one industry, ranging from healthcare to manufacturing, transport, energy, finance, and so on. So for a look at the content, well, you can see here the different chapters covered by the study, and I will give you a brief overview of these and go into some more depth in some of them. So first of all, the drivers. Why do companies adopt anti-corruption measures? This is about understanding the motivation of companies. Secondly, how do companies assess their corruption risks? Because of course, to implement effective compliance measures, you need to know where your risks lie. Models of compliance. What anti-corruption measures do companies adopt? Well, this goes into the different mechanisms taken by companies to embed an anti-corruption culture in the company, ranging from codes of conduct to training with regard to third parties, plans of actions for dealing with suspicions of corruption, other types of policies addressing particular corruption risks, such as gift giving and travel, although perhaps travel is less of an issue these days. It ends by discussing how companies provide oversight for these programs. What resources are available? Well, we know that undertaking appropriate anti-corruption compliance can require a significant investment of time and resources, something that may be a luxury in many corporations and perhaps especially in SMEs. So finding easily available resources to assist with the development of the program is critical for many firms, and companies are constantly looking for sources of best practices. Study participants indicated that they rely, of course, on advice provided by their governments, but they also look to international sources of guidance, which are considered more country neutral and can be seen by some as helpful when sharing the compliance program outside their home countries. Business associations, both at the international and local level, play an important role in providing guidance to companies, and particularly with regard to corruption risks that are unique to particular sectors, such as the healthcare sector, which I understand you will be focusing on later today. Companies also, of course, look to their peers for ideas about best practices in compliance. And what are the challenges? Well, in 2020, compliance is no longer in its infancy. Now, I remember 10 years ago, the concept of compliance was something very North American, but now it's really become a global industry. Still, compliance faces some serious challenges today, and some are not so different from 10 years ago. So I'll go a little bit into more detail on that shortly. And finally, the view ahead and the way forward, because we, of course, wanted to draw some conclusions from the survey. So we asked companies their wish lists, so to speak, and developed some recommendations for companies, from governments, and for international organizations. For reasons of time, my presentation today will focus on 3 elements of this study. I'll give you an overview of the drivers that push companies to adopt anti-corruption compliance programs, and spend a bit of time as well on the challenges that compliance officers and companies still face today. And I will conclude with the possible ways forward for companies, governments, and the international community at large. I, of course, invite you to read the full study, which is available free of charge online for a more thorough understanding. So, first of all, Why do companies adopt anti-corruption compliance measures today? We asked respondents to indicate the primary reason that a company took steps to establish a program, although we are aware, of course, that the decision to establish such a program can be multifaceted. And the overwhelming majority of survey respondents, over 80%, indicated that avoiding prosecution was a major factor in their decision to establish the program, while an even greater percentage, close to 90%, pointed to a desire to protect the company's reputation. Now, concerns regarding enforcement and reputational risk can take different forms. Well, first, of course, a company that has itself come under investigation for corruption will almost certainly establish a compliance program to avoid similar incidents, perhaps to obtain credit in sentencing, and to restore operations and faith in the company. But there's something that we noticed and that we call the bystander effect, which is also a very strong motivation. And this comes from watching similarly situated companies face investigations. So to take concrete examples, one survey respondent said that it had established an anti-corruption program after watching other pharmaceutical companies being prosecuted and learning from their mistakes or resulting best practices. Another interviewee explained that many of our competitors have been under investigation and we have seen the financial results for them. We consider that the size of our company would not support the cost of a prosecution or a settlement. And you will not be surprised if I tell you that prosecutions across several countries raise awareness in particular sectors or in particular areas of the world. And this is something that came through from many companies in Latin America. And the compliance representative of a South American company explained notably that the Odebrecht case, for instance, had been a wake-up call for South and Latin America. And this is a situation that reminds us of the Siemens case in Europe around 2008, which was also a wake-up call for European companies at that time. Internal motivations, doing business the right way, was indicated by a large number of respondents as weighing heavily in their decision to establish a compliance program. And this is a more sociological motivator, and one that perhaps I won't spend too much time on here because it is certainly not my area of expertise. But perhaps more interestingly, many companies decided to establish an anti-corruption compliance program to be in a stronger position vis-a-vis customers and investors. Close to 40% of respondents indicated that an interest in obtaining government contracts was a determining factor in their decision to establish an anti-corruption compliance program, and a number that reached 50% when it came to obtaining non-governmental contracts. Survey respondents mentioned requirements from a joint venture partner, an investor, a majority shareholder. And this pressure from the supply chain may be a particularly strong motivator for SMEs, which want to maintain business relationships with larger companies. So for example, a large company might require its subcontractors to sign a certification that they will abide with the larger company's anti-corruption compliance policy. And if this happens often enough and with enough different companies, the small companies may choose to adopt their own policies. And we have one very concrete case study where an SME managing director, who was also the compliance manager, explained that all of the large companies it did work for either required it to have its own code of conduct, or if it didn't, to answer a lengthy list of additional questions about ethics in order to get hired. So it was just easier for the SME to develop its own code of conduct rather than having to go through the lengthy vetting process each time it entered a contract. Two additional factors that came out through comments and interviews relate to legal changes. And this is first changes in the legislation, which are, of course, a significant factor in the adoption or in the strengthening of anti-corruption compliance program. And indeed, this is a trend that we see in recent years when countries have adopted or modified their legislation on corporate liability. There has been a clear tendency to include requirements on companies, or at least companies above a certain size, to adopt anti-corruption compliance measures. And survey respondents cited in particular the Loi Sapin 2 in France or the Ley Anti-Soborno introduced in 2016 in Colombia. Another legal change can be changes in business activity, and this may of course impact a company's decision to take a closer look at its anti-corruption compliance. For instance, we had one US company said that they undertook a corruption risk analysis when it acquired a Latin American company. Another state-owned enterprise established a compliance program when it decided to sell some of its stock to the public because the company's management wanted to convey confidence to potential investors, both locally and at the international level. So I will now turn to the challenges that compliance officers and companies still face today to make anti-corruption compliance effective. And the first factor, or one of the first two factors that came out, was the "it will never happen to us." A lot of respondents, well over half, said they had to fight a perception within the company that compliance is not needed, that I don't need a compliance program. And this often comes down to the fact that corruption risks are intangible until an incident occurs. And how can this perception be changed? Well, it often starts with the organization's leadership. And this brings me to my second factor here. And it may be surprising for those of you who've been in the compliance field for a long time, or I don't know, maybe it's not a surprise at all. But yes, today still a very large majority of respondents, 61%, indicate that executive commitment to anti-corruption remains a challenge. Now, as overused as the phrase "tone from the top" may be, we know how essential it is to have the board on board from the very first moment you go about setting up compliance systems in a company. And the first step, of course, is the risk assessment, which, to quote one compliance officer, is just the most important thing a compliance officer might do. Now, conducting a risk assessment prior to engaging in a compliance program allows a company to identify the personnel and the business areas where training and awareness raising needs to be targeted, and to determine potential areas of conflict between the company's compliance program requirements and other corporate policies and procedures. And the idea is to sort of resolve these conflicts before they occur. This is really the point from which the entire compliance process will be rolled out. And of course, this risk assessment needs to take into account the evolution of risks, and for instance, those triggered by the COVID-19 crisis right now. Now, many functions of the company will be involved in this risk assessment: legal, internal audit, sales and marketing, supply chain, etc. But of critical importance is management's involvement at all stages of the risk assessment. And without high-level management support, these risk assessments run the risk of being really just an academic exercise without a practical impact on the company. And perhaps this brings us back to the reason compliance officers cited enforcement as the biggest driver of compliance, because they know that when all other factors fail, well, that's a pretty certain way of catching the attention of management. Adequate resources, of course, continue to be critical to the effectiveness of anti-corruption compliance. The problem here is that compliance is sometimes viewed as a cost center, and obtaining resources for the compliance function can be difficult. The risk of corruption is often considered only a potential threat, whereas the risk of losing business is seen as a much more immediate and concrete threat. And this challenge of resources can be particularly keen for SMEs because, of course, they cannot spread the costs of developing and implementing an anti-corruption compliance program across as large a business as big multinationals. This issue of resources is, of course, very closely intertwined with the pressure to make profits, which several interviewees, compliance officers, explained is often fundamentally at odds with the importance of a compliance program. Now, one company officer said pretty drastically that he'd like to kill the bonuses because they inherently conflict with ethics. Another, with a perhaps softer approach, suggested that key performance indicators could include anti-bribery compliance. Now, these two last factors, adequate resources and the pressure to make profit, are challenges that are very likely to be exacerbated by the current COVID-19 crisis and the ensuing economic crisis, which will strain company resources. As companies seek to restart business in an increasingly competitive environment, the risk of corruption and bribery may become more prevalent, but the resources may become more scarce. In addition, the current pandemic and the impossibility of traveling will make it more difficult for large companies to really root their anti-corruption compliance worldwide across their organization. For a program to be effective, it really is key to be able to adapt it to local needs and to meet with people on the ground to overcome possible cultural hurdles, not only within the organization, but also when it comes to conveying the program effectively to third parties. There is only so much you can do from the headquarters, and you need to communicate and rely on local personnel, and not being able to physically travel to meet with your teams on the ground will undoubtedly make the task more difficult. And finally, I'd like to spend a minute on the importance of maintaining momentum, the sort of "are we done now" factor. Once the program is in place, once perhaps you've achieved certification, is compliance done? And the answer, of course, is no. One compliance officer said, now that we have the ISO certification, everyone seems relaxed, but that is not acceptable to me. And another shared, I do not want to hear a manager saying, we are done. The program is continuously growing and the program is never done. We keep improving and finding new and better solutions. So following this overview of some of the concerns voiced by business, I will attempt to distill these findings into key suggestions that may help companies, governments, and the international community more effectively fight corruption by supporting anti-corruption compliance. And let's first look at, what does the compliance function need? Well, the compliance function needs a seat at the management table in the form of appropriate executive support and autonomy. It needs a compliance culture, which includes clear company standards, including responses to potential infractions, but also regular communications to demonstrate to all members of the corporation that you are serious about your commitment to integrity. And this means working together. As I said, a central team can only do so much to enforce a global compliance program. You need to rely on local personnel on the ground who know local risks, who have built relationships of trust, as essential teammates in building and maintaining your compliance program. And this, as I said, may be an even greater challenge in these difficult times. Beyond the company, of course, businesses can engage to exchange best practices with others in their industry or in their geographical area. There can be opportunities for collective action as well, either at the industry level or in the context of a particular procurement contract. Companies can also work through business associations to create standards of expectations for compliant conduct. And this can be particularly helpful in bringing together SMEs for discussions of anti-corruption compliance issues. What do companies want? Well, many companies would like to see support for their efforts in the form of government commitment, including timely enforcement of corruption offenses, but also strengthening trust in the rule of law. And here at the OECD, there are things we can do to strengthen this, to support this. One thing that we do is maintain peer pressure among all the countries, the 44 countries that have signed the Anti-Bribery Convention, to ensure that the laws are applied fairly across the membership. We do this through country reviews, and in 2018, we reviewed Korea's implementation of the convention, and we will review again the efforts made by Korea next June. We, of course, continue to encourage also countries to share best practices. And of course, we need to facilitate coordination among law enforcement in cases that span several countries. And this is something that we do in the context of our bi-yearly meetings of law enforcement officials. It also means, from the OECD, engaging with key economies, notably G20 countries that are not yet signatories to the convention. So we had some progress very recently with Saudi Arabia joining the working group on bribery, that's to say the countries party to the convention, for a first step, because right now Saudi Arabia is an observer, but is not yet a signatory to the convention. And we must, of course, continue efforts to work with China, India, and Indonesia to strive to establish a level playing field. This is something that we do in the context of our work in the OECD and on the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, but also in the context of the G20. And finally, from the OECD perspective, it means working with what we call demand-side countries, where the rule of law may sometimes be weaker, where resources may be more of an issue, and where there may be benefits here too in sharing good practices, be it in the area of law enforcement or corporate compliance. We do this notably in the context of several OECD regional initiatives, in particular with the Asian Development Bank in Southeast Asia, but also in many other regions of the world. Coming back to what companies want, well, they also want the adoption of clear legislative requirements in terms of compliance programs, but they stress that they would like these requirements to be flexible to allow companies to adapt their programs to their needs. And finally, from governments, companies want assistance, and this can take the form of analytical tools provided to companies to help them in assessing corruption risks or in demonstrating the concrete benefits of anti-corruption compliance programs. But companies would also like to see concrete assistance in the form of incentives for compliance. And at a minimum, companies said that they would like an effective compliance program to be recognized as a defense in legal proceedings. But several study participants would like more than that. They would like governments to provide positive incentives to virtual companies, as is done in other areas, such as for companies that adopt green technologies. These incentives could take the form of tax incentives or rebates, or public accolades for anti-corruption efforts. Now, for a slight example about Korea, in our latest review of Korea, we noted that the Korean government had many initiatives in place to engage and to support its private sector, including by the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, the Ministry of Justice, or the Fair Player Club. But we urged Korea to deepen this approach to provide even greater support, including by engaging other agencies, notably the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who can have a role in supporting Korean companies that are operating abroad, and to engage and incentivize Korean companies, including SMEs, to adopt adequate anti-corruption compliance systems. And finally, what can the international community do? Well, it can help respond to these demands by educating and assisting companies and developing learning about corruption, including through case studies, through this one that I'm presenting today, but many others. And this is something that the OECD strives and will continue to strive to do. And of course, discussing these in real and virtual fora such as today's. The international community can help in breaking down silos because compliance personnel are also dealing with antitrust requirements, money laundering and counter-terrorist financing obligation, environmental concerns, human rights issues, and I'm just naming a few. So looking for ways to create synergies between different compliance areas can help advance compliance globally. And finally, the international community can take steps to support and even participate in collective action efforts to fight corruption. So, in conclusion, many companies would like to fight corruption, but they do not want to fight it alone. They want to see governments walking the talk by supporting corporate anti-corruption efforts with appropriate incentives, by enforcing laws effectively, and by themselves operating with the highest standards of integrity. And importantly, companies do not see the task of awareness raising about corruption issues as over. I thank you very much for your attention today and invite you to have a more thorough read of the study available online. I wish you very fruitful discussions today. Thank you very much.